and welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio. We're here with Guy Bentley, who's a great friend of the show. Guy Bentley is Director of Consumer Freedom Research at the Reason Foundation. You might have read some of his articles that he's covered, everything from taxation and regulation. He talks about nicotine, he talks about tobacco, alcohol, food, gambling, the whole gamut. Guy, thanks so much for being on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
So yeah, I wanted to start out really quick on a sort of a political note. You are a immigré to the United States, and you got to see another election. So what was that like, just kind of being there in the Capitol or around the election, hearing the results like the rest of us? What has that kind of been like for you?
It was definitely tense. I remember in the week running up to the election, you had all shops and restaurants, everyone being boarded up, anticipating civil unrest if there was a Trump victory, and just a real air of tension. And I remember watching the results as they were coming in, and I think everyone was confused. The polls had got it wrong in so many different directions by such magnitudes. But in the end, despite the sort of furore we've been having afterwards with, contested ballots and lawsuits and all the rest of it. Thankfully, in most places, it's been a bit of an anticlimax. We didn't have mass rioting and civil unrest that some people were predicting. So that was an optimistic note. And I think a lot of people could draw what they wanted out of this election. It was not really a clear mandate for one party or the other. We're left again with divided government at the federal level and not many things changing at the state level. I mean, in fact, some improvements on the Republican side on the state level in terms of houses, in state houses and governorships. So a really unclear result from what's very much a divided electorate and a sort of realignment in politics, with the two parties now assembling very different coalitions to the ones they had just 10 years ago.
Let's talk about some of those state victories, particularly the ballot initiatives. You have on reason.org a couple of articles where you're analyzing several of the propositions related to vaping, e-cigarettes, gaming, sports betting. Walk us through a couple of these and which ones you think are the most interesting, I guess, for consumer freedom.
Yeah. Well, for consumers, it was a mixed bag in terms of ballot initiatives. On the bad side, we had initiatives in Colorado and Oregon that were planned to increase both the cost of cigarettes and the cost of e-cigarette products, which is a particular problem because e-cigarettes, as we now know, are dramatically safer alternatives to combustible cigarettes, and are a great way for people who can't or don't want to otherwise quit smoking to switch away to something less harmful. And unfortunately, both Colorado and Oregon voted to dramatically increase taxes on these products. In Colorado, the tax is going to be around 56% of the wholesale value of e-cigarette products, and that's going to rise to 62% in 2027. And in Oregon, similarly, there's going to be a 65% wholesale e-cigarette tax. So really a sort of, bad move for public health policy. And the price of cigarettes dramatically increasing as well, which, in a time where we're suffering, severe economic downturns because of the pandemic, a lot of retailers and businesses will suffer from this. And we will see, as we've seen with dramatic tax increases in other states like California and New York, a massive increase in the illicit cigarette trade and cigarette smuggling. So that was unfortunately a bad loss for consumer freedom there. However, there were some good notes. We've had, throughout 2019, we had a raft of states legalizing sports betting, which previously states had been forbidden to do, which was absolutely crazy. It was thanks to a ridiculous law passed in 1992 called the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act, which banned states from legalizing sports betting. That was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2018, and states have immediately been jumping on this because the illegal sports betting market in the US is estimated to be around $150 billion. and a majority of Americans engage in some kind of sports betting. So states are quite rightly jumping on this bandwagon and legalizing sports betting. And the voters of Maryland voted overwhelmingly to legalize sports betting, and the details of that will be left up to the legislature. So we had some good news there. And on the drugs front, we had interesting initiatives in Oregon. They did something bad with having a war on drugs on nicotine and tobacco, but they did decriminalize the possession and use of small amounts of what are I think wrongly called hard drugs, such as heroin and cocaine and so on, which sounds very worrying to lots of people, having these drugs decriminalized. But in fact, Portugal, many years ago, we do have an example in the early 2000s where Portugal decriminalized these hard drugs. And in fact, what we saw was lower rates of incarceration, lower rates of drug addiction, more focus on treating this as a medical problem rather than a criminal problem. So that was actually fantastic news. And also we had several states, again, leading the parade with legalization of marijuana, including Mississippi, which legalized, but only for now for medical use. But we also saw Montana, New Jersey, Arizona. So I think we're really in the sort of final death throes of the war on marijuana. So a mixed bag.
One note real quick on Mississippi. I have one of my former editors. She lives in Mississippi, a super conservative place. And she had never expected that this would ever pass or ever get to any level. And the fact that we can have medical cannabis in a place like Mississippi just shows that the rest of the dominoes are going to fall pretty soon, right?
Yeah. No, yes. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's just a minute time. So, I mean, it's funny you talk about Oregon because it's, like you said, a mixed bag, both pros and cons. But anecdotally, one of my favorite tweets that was tweeted after the result, I think, actually probably from last week, someone was like, if I have 11 people over for Thanksgiving, the cops go up, but if we're all smoking crack, it's okay. On sports betting, though, because that's an interesting one, and Yaël and I have talked about this maybe a little bit. It's not something that we've really kind of dug into. Are we talking all betting? Are we talking in-game betting? Or what were some of the rules that were struck down of at the state level? And I ask this because I know in the Canadian context, you can bet on games through the provincial authority, but you have to parlay them together. You can't do single game betting. You can't do all of the fun in-game betting that people love to do these days. So what was the status of where things stood? And do we have any insight as to how liberal or how open these betting markets are going to be?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And previously under PASPA, it was rather confusing because all sports betting was illegal, or states rather prevented from legalizing all sports betting. Of course, you had Nevada, though, was the exception. And there were some eccentric exceptions for some states, I believe Montana and a couple of others, with grandfathered in games that nobody played on, I think there was some things with horse racing and a few other very old things. But there was also this fascinating gray market that developed with fantasy football, DraftKings and all the rest of it, which was in a gray market because that is not considered real sports or sports betting, because of course it's not real teams. So, however, states and some attorneys general did think about trying to reinterpret law to include these things, but it never really happened. So, but thankfully that's all over now. Everything is legal. In terms of the structure and how states are doing in terms of what you can do or so on, I'm not aware of any restrictions that have been in place on in-game betting and so on. I'd have to double check that, but I believe it is most states a fairly liberal regime in most states. And thankfully, a lot of states have understood that, yes, this can be something of a revenue raising measure, right? You're legalizing this huge illegal market that many people play. You will raise some money from it. But most states have actually been fairly restrained in how they're taxing this new activity. Nevada's tax is around 6.5%. So if you think of that as a baseline for a successful, gambling market,
It's reasonable.
Exactly. Most states are staying in around the single digits or low double digits. Anything above that, you're really destroying the profitability of gaming operators. Although there have been interesting cronyism issues with some of the leagues demanding what are called integrity fees to be put in with legalizing sports betting, essentially a 1% tax on the handle, so the total amount bet, because they believe that, well, they're providing these games which people are deriving value off, they should get some of that back, and also they should pay for keeping the games clean. Now, as you guys know, in Europe, with very liberal betting markets, you do not have this, and there is very little corruption in games. There's great cooperation between law enforcement and gaming operators and policing. Thankfully, that most states have rejected that, thankfully, although 2 do have them.
Wow. Everybody needs their cut, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, everybody wants their piece of the pie. I do have to say the in-game betting side is so much fun from a spectator's point of view. A good friend of mine, we were at a Blue Jays game in Toronto. Baseball at the best of times isn't necessarily the most riveting sport. But when you can live bet that the guy at bat is going to hit a double and wager any amount from a penny up, it just completely changes the consumer experience at the game. And it was like in that moment where I was like, oh wow, this is a lot of fun. And it's not like you have like $3-4 bet minimums and you're wasting a lot of money. You can literally throw a penny down on things that have insane odds, and it just creates a whole nother perspective to the game, which was super fun. So it's exciting to hear that that American states are kind of driving in that direction. On the decriminalization front in Oregon, just to go back to that quickly, at least from my point of view, it's starting to seem that people are coming around, even conservatives to a certain extent. And I wanted to ask you if you feel the same way. Has there been a real negative pushback to this, or are people kind of starting to see that this is generally the way to go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Just getting back to the sports betting point on in-game betting, that is one of the often overlooked great benefits of legalizing sports betting is enthusiasm for games. If you make games that are perhaps marginally interesting, whether it's the sport or the actual game that is happening, you increase a lot of consumer enthusiasm for games. You have more people watching, there's more interest. So that's another great benefit for the industry as well. I totally agree with that. In terms of Oregon specifically and decriminalization of possession and use of small amounts of heroin and cocaine and so on, I think many conservatives have come around to ideas of marijuana decriminalization and legalization. I still think that decriminalization of those categories of drugs is probably still a step too far for many conservatives. That's probably a line they would not want to cross. And there are some quite obvious incentives as to why that might be the case. Unlike marijuana, the use rates for those kind of drugs are minuscule. I mean, really, it really rarely for any of those drugs, whether it's cocaine or heroin, frequent use of those drugs rarely is above 1% of the population for recreational use. Same with LSD and these other kinds. So there isn't the kind of mass constituency that there is for marijuana legalization. And also these drugs, people still don't fully understand them. They don't fully understand that most people who use these drugs are not addicts, for instance. There's still a lot of misperception around many of these drugs. But there is one drug that could perhaps be gaining more ground, and that's magic mushrooms, because the FDA has granted psilocybin, which is the active chemical within magic mushrooms that essentially gets you high. gives you that experience, that in certain contexts, FDA has given that special status as a potential therapeutic drug. So that can accelerate the process of research into how that kind of drug can be used. And in Washington, D.C., there was Initiative 88, which was a decriminalization, but not a decriminalization. I could go into that if you want, but it's a bit eccentric to the district, which was approved overwhelmingly by voters. And that's happened in several other cities across the country as well. And especially because, magic mushrooms, these are not, you don't see massive rates of addiction to it. There's not a lot of people getting in their cars after using that and so on, like alcohol or sometimes marijuana. So I would say there's an entry point for that kind of liberalization because it also has a medicinal benefit. But when you're talking about cocaine and heroin, I think that's probably still a step too far.
That's true. There we go. That's Guy Bentley. We're here on Consumer Choice Radio. He is Director of Consumer Freedom at the Reason Foundation. You can also follow him on Twitter at GBentley1. Guy, you've been a newspaper reporter, a writer. I enjoyed many of your articles many years ago when you were writing off in foreign capitals and also in the States. One thing that I wanted to bring up is the pandemic. And I know many people are focusing a lot more on the political horse races and things that are happening. But sitting where I am, this is still a huge deal. And I think lockdowns are probably going to be part of our narrative for a while. So how is, looking at your research and the things that you look at, how is the pandemic kind of affecting that? Or what are some interesting questions that you're kind of asking now that we're seeing, I guess, a longer term impact of the COVID age?
Yes, well, this is now the sort of multi-trillions of dollars question that has been, bankrupting, us at a rapid pace. In terms of many of the areas I look at, there are, crises always bring about reforms and new thinking. It's unfortunate that sometimes you need crises for lawmakers and legislators to reconsider failed policies that just sort of stay in place as a sort of stasis. For instance, if we look at issues like alcohol regulation and regulation of the service economy and restaurants and bars and diners and so on, we've seen many states in the US and other countries abroad react by liberalizing laws around alcohol sales, for instance, to go cocktails or beers and so on, reforming things like open container laws, so you can drink outside and so on, and socially distance and all the rest of that. These are all positive reforms that should have happened anyway, but have been accelerated by the crisis. There is, however, one, I think, very harmful narrative that is going around. Particularly, I see this in the United Kingdom, and I do see some murmur of this in the US, which is that we all know obesity as a comorbidity for COVID-19. So many people in public health and some legislators say that, well, we need to clamp down on population-wide obesity. So we should introduce new kinds of taxes on foods people are eating or drinks they're consuming and so on. And I think that's entirely the wrong approach. Obesity is a risk factor for many other diseases anyway. It is not hard in this society to know that obesity is bad for your health. This is not exactly a state secret. So introducing more taxes and regulations on food in the service industry, these are very ineffective at reducing obesity rates anyway. And it's exactly the wrong response where you have the hospitality industry on its knees, many restaurants and bars and so on going out of business. And the last thing that survivors of this onslaught need are new costs deterring consumers from buying and enjoying the products that they like. So I see that as quite a negative trend that's coming out of the pandemic at the moment. And also,
surprise coming from the UK. What a surprise that this would pop out there.
Exactly. Terribly surprising at all. And of course, the sad thing is many states are going to have massive budget holes, and so they're going to need to find either new revenue or large spending cuts. And unfortunately, tax rises and increases will be on the way. And one of the go-to things are popular products that people consume. So that could be a trend to watch out for. But again, it's very short-termist. You don't want to, go for a quick money grab and then healthily destroy, the hospitality sector or small businesses selling these products that are the backbone of your local economies.
And what's interesting always about these tax policies is that they never, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time. I don't think I've ever seen any politician come at it from the other way and say, hey, obesity is a problem, so we're going to do a $200 tax credit over the course of a year for fitness programs, gym memberships, sports leagues, like things that will induce you to burn calories and to be active. And I've always looked at that as like, well, why? Like, why is the reaction always to restrict when you could enable folks? And I was wondering if you've seen any examples on the other side of that equation, or if you see any value in suggestions like that.
Yeah, there have been proposals like that put forward by people in the field of public health in order to try and incentivize, for instance, buying healthier groceries or exactly as you say, giving gym memberships and so on. And these things have been tried at the micro level. The problem is they kind of like the stick approach, the carrot approach just doesn't seem to yield many effects. There have been small scale programs, I believe, in the UK and the Netherlands, with focused on children, but these are quite intensive programs. And of course, focusing on children, it's not adults who are totally making their own decisions and live by themselves, have their own habits, so on. With children, you sort of have a captive audience and you can influence the school environment. And I don't see a lot wrong with that at all. Kids are kids, and it's up to adults to try and raise the kids, and when they're adults they can choose for themselves. That's totally fine. When it comes to adults, I don't see a great deal of value in, for instance, I don't know, subsidizing people to go to Whole Foods instead of instead of something else, because it doesn't yield the effects you would want, and could be quite costly. I think the thing is with obesity is, we know how to not be obese. It's don't eat so much and exercise. This is not rocket science. There are many sort of different theories and so on, but it's not rocket science. The thing is, a lot of people just enjoy foods that are unhealthy because they're very tasty. And in a free society, people are going to make those choices, and it's a trade-off. Great economist Thomas Sowell said there were no solutions, only trade-offs, and this is one of them.
Wow, that's the second time I've heard that quote today, and I love it. One thing, I think is always missing from this is also private initiative. There's a reason the Peloton bike was such like a huge popular craze in many suburbs and places. But, we see a lot of these private initiatives that happen, and much like, and I've seen you argue this very similarly, much like vaping and e-cigarettes, the fact that these things are done by private entrepreneurs or by private groups or done really outside of the chambers of government, it's as if it's nothing to celebrate. It's as if everything needs to emanate from, the health bureau or agency or institute. I know one quick example is for insurance companies, they have kind of their own incentives. If you have a physical, but also if you have like stellar health performance, they're actually going to lower your rates. They do that at my dad's work, and they got everybody wearing Fitbits and walking around. And if you can run a mile faster, then your insurance costs will actually go down. So they've like gamified it. But of course, because it's a private institution and it's private actors, it's as if it's not celebrated as much.
Yeah. No, that's a really excellent point. And, a lot of public health officials and governments are behind the times on this. So if you look at things like obesity, for instance, soda is one of the big things people carp on about. We need soda taxes or bans or restrictions. Soda consumption in the US has been declining for years now. I mean, many, many years. Soda consumption has been continuously declining. And now you see all these, kind of things that the market is providing, like, LaCroix flavored waters and all the rest, low or zero calorie or all the rest. And you're talking about Peloton. And again, there's a cultural side to this in which, back in the sort of very olden days, it was a status symbol to sort of be fat because it showed that you were wealthy and you could afford lots of food and indulge and all. We're talking, a long time ago now. Now it's a sort of cultural status symbol to be, healthy, fit and trim, and that you can resist the pressures of, fast food and all the rest of that. So society adapts and changes, and obesity rates in the US, they were stagnant for a long time. They've gone up, I think only a touch in the last few years. I don't really anticipate in the long term that rate coming down as society shifts and what becomes societally accepted or society desirable amongst people changes. And as you say, you've seen explosions in the number of gyms and opportunities to exercise and so on, and not just the horrendously expensive things like, what is it, that Soul Cycle thing, or not these ludicrous.
Don't hate because you don't ride.
Yeah, I do not ride. But at many price points, which makes it easier to entry, and explosions of choices in what you can eat and eat healthier, and cookbooks and diets and all the rest. There is no lack of information or resources if people want to take it.
Yeah, and food delivered to your home, ready for you to cook. That's been something that's like, it can be calorie conscious. It cannot be calorie conscious. That's ultimately up to you. But there are all sorts of services. I know throughout the early part of the pandemic, we were just having good food delivered, and it's a cool cooking experience. And you're like, oh, okay, well that full meal only had 650 calories. That's actually pretty good.
David, are you talking about things like Blue Apron or HelloFresh and so? Okay, not a sponsor, but we'd love to have you guys as a sponsor.
Yeah,
That's great
yeah.
stuff.
No free ads. But yeah, they are good. They're great services in that sense. I mean, obviously, kind of heightened by the pandemic because it was the ultimate convenience to just stay at home and have it delivered essentially in a cardboard cooler to your door. But yeah, lots of interesting private initiatives that are kind of driving this. I even see it in the alcohol market, like Michelob Ultra. If you didn't know what Michelob Ultra was prior to seeing advertisements for it, you think they were advertising a CrossFit gym because their whole brand is built around people who are fit, who want to have a beer, but they don't want to feel guilty about it. And so I do think that like this trend overall will, whether it's low calorie or 0 calorie sodas or reduced calorie beers or other things that are otherwise kind of in air quotes unhealthy, I do think that this trend is going to continue to see, we'll eventually see obesity rates decline as we generally become more conscious of it. So that's all positive. The key is, can we get there before legislators start proposing all sorts of other crazy policies?
No, that's great. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, you talk about the alcohol market. If you look at the alcohol market, you see sales of traditional beer, domestic beer, heavy calorie beer, reduced quite substantially over the last few years, with a lot of people switching to liquor. There's this sort of great, there really hasn't been a better time to be a drinker in America than since Prohibition. Prices are reasonable, competition's intense. You've had the craft beer revolution. You also have now this sort of explosion in the number of spirits and cocktail culture. You see a lot of younger people switching between drinking a lot of beers to having a few cocktails and things like that.
Seltzers, can't forget those, man. Hard seltzers.
And seltzers.
I was just going to say it wouldn't be an episode of Consumer Choice Radio without Yaël mentioning seltzers. He is a big fan.
Well, we don't have them. We don't have them in Europe at all. And there was one that was introduced. The UK probably has one or two. And I've seen some of them introduced a little bit by some grocery store chains here, but they just don't taste the same, man.
Shame.
Shade. Yeah. So Guy Bentley, awesome guy. Obviously amazing research over there at reason.org. Guy, just to kind of close it out, what are some of the things that you've got your eye on, that you've got your thumb on the scale pointing towards obese, that you got your thumb on your scale that, you're looking at, and things that maybe listeners can follow?
Yeah, I think one thing we're really looking at is a big push to ban flavored tobacco products. We've seen Massachusetts was the first state in the country to ban all flavored tobacco products. So that's your flavored cigars, menthol cigarettes, e-cigarette flavors, and all the rest of it. And to the shock of absolutely no one, there has been an absolute surge in trafficking of these products from New Hampshire and Rhode Island. I mean, tens and tens of millions of dollars just in the first few months of when that prohibition was introduced, I believe in June or July. So really not an example for other states to follow. Yet California has done so and banned these products, but there is a ballot initiative next year that signatures are being gathered for on whether to repeal that. There will be a big push for that in a lot of states, possibly at the federal level as well. And I think an important thing to point out about this is the inclusion of menthol cigarettes. You see in the US, most African Americans who smoke menthols, around 85%. And so prohibiting menthol cigarettes while keeping other cigarettes on the market, you can see the obvious problem. There are claims made that they are more addictive or they're somehow worse for you. This has been studied very extensively. Menthol cigarettes are just as dangerous as regular cigarettes. They're not safer, but they're also not worse for you than regular cigarettes. So why target a tobacco product mostly used by Black Americans where tobacco products used mostly by white Americans remain legal? And I think that's obviously discriminatory and will have a terrible impact in terms of criminal justice and over-policing. And that's why the American Civil Liberties Union has also been very much against this. So that's something we focused on in our research and showing that, in fact, Black youth are far less likely than white youth to smoke cigarettes. So the idea that, this is to protect African-American children is totally fallacious. So we see that as a discriminatory ban that we'll be fighting very hard against.
And it's a real head scratcher given the collective conversation the country is having about racial disparities already. It's like, okay, we're having this very progressive, forward-thinking conversation about the reality that people experience life differently and racism exists and there are institutional factors at that. And people are generally coming around in terms of having that conversation and trying to make some change, while at the same time kind of reversing the car and say, no, yeah, we're going to make some progress, but we're going to erase some of that by creating what are, as you've described, clearly discriminatory laws. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Hopefully there is enough push to urge legislators to maybe rethink some of these things. Guy, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio, and we'll have to have you back. Definitely a friend of the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.